There is something that most people never talk about. Not the breakup itself, not the arguments, not the goodbye, but what happens after. Because the real reaction from a man doesn't come when you are crying. It doesn't come when you are explaining yourself. It doesn't even come when you are asking for another chance. It comes later, when you become quiet, when you stop chasing, when you stop reacting, and most importantly, when you start moving on peacefully. And here's the truth that surprises many men. Your peace confuses him more than your pain ever did. At first, he doesn't even believe it. He thinks it's temporary. He thinks maybe you are pretending. Maybe you are trying to get his attention. Maybe you are just waiting for him to come back. Because in his mind, the version of you he remembers is the version that still emotionally reacts to him. But then something changes. Days pass, and you don't reach out. Weeks pass, and you don't beg. You don't argue. You don't even ask questions. You just disappear from emotional noise. And slowly, something uncomfortable starts building inside him. Not love at first, not regret yet, confusion. Because a man can understand anger, he can understand sadness, he can even understand begging. But he does not easily understand peace after emotional attachment. That kind of peace feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things make people uncomfortable. So he starts thinking, why is she not reacting? Why is she so calm? Does she not care at all? Has she already moved on? And that last question is the one he tries to ignore but cannot, because deep down, he expected something different. He expected emotional consequences. He expected silence mixed with pain. He expected signs that you are still affected. But instead, he gets calmness. And calmness feels like distance. Not physical distance, emotional distance. And that is where the shift begins. Because the moment a man realizes he is no longer emotionally affecting you the same way, he starts questioning his own importance in your life. And this is the part he never tells anyone. Not his friends, not his ego, not even himself. He starts checking small things. Your online presence, your activity, your silence patterns, your energy. Not because he wants to come back yet, but because he is trying to confirm something. He is trying to confirm whether you are really gone emotionally. And here is what most people don't understand. A peaceful woman after heartbreak is not weak. She is unreadable. And being unreadable is what unsettles a man the most. Because when you were emotional, he could understand you. When you were upset, he knew where he stood. But when you are peaceful, he no longer knows if he still has access to your emotions. Slowly starts to grow inside him. Even when he pretends it doesn't matter. Even when he acts normal. Even when he distracts himself. There is a small voice inside him asking, did I lose her without realizing it? And that question doesn't leave easily. Because peace is not loud, but it is powerful. And when a man finally sees that you have moved on peacefully, it doesn't break him immediately. It unsettles him first. Silently, deeply, and in ways he cannot explain. There comes a point when the shock starts to wear off. At first, he told himself a simple story. She'll come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. He believed that because it felt comfortable. It protected him from having to face something deeper. The possibility that you were actually moving forward. Not pretending, not trying to make him jealous, not waiting for a text, not secretly hoping he would change. Just moving forward. And when that realization slowly starts becoming real, something strange begins happening inside him. He becomes emotionally confused. Not because he suddenly understands everything, and not because he suddenly turns into a different person, but because reality starts clashing with his expectations. You see, many people expect emotional reactions to follow a predictable path. They expect heartbreak to look a certain way. They expect sadness. They expect longing. They expect someone to remain emotionally available. But when you move on peacefully, you disrupt that expectation. And that creates questions. A lot of questions. Questions he didn't expect to ask himself. Questions he never thought would matter. Questions that start showing up at random moments. While driving, while working, while scrolling through his phone, while lying awake at night. The questions arrive quietly. Is she really okay? Has she met someone else? Does she still think about me? Was I more important to her than she was to me? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what if she's actually happy without me? That thought lands differently, because happiness changes everything. If you're angry, there is still emotion. If you're hurt, there is still attachment. If you're waiting, there is still hope. But happiness suggests something much harder to accept. It suggests freedom. And freedom means you are no longer emotionally tied to the past. That is when confusion deepens, because he remembers the woman who cared, the woman who invested emotionally, the woman who made time, the woman who worried, the woman who loved. So how did that woman become so calm? How did she stop reacting? How did she stop needing answers? How did she stop looking back? The mind struggles to understand what it didn't expect, and that's exactly where he finds himself, trying to understand, trying to make sense of things, trying to connect dots that no longer connect, because the version of you in his memory no longer matches the version of you he sees now, and that creates emotional tension. The human mind likes certainty. It likes predictable outcomes, but your peaceful growth removes certainty. Now he doesn't know what you're thinking. He doesn't know what you're feeling. And when people don't know where they stand, they often start paying more attention. That's why this stage is important.
Not because he's suddenly obsessed, not because he's suddenly desperate, but because he's becoming aware. Aware that something has changed. Aware that your life is moving. Aware that time is passing. Aware that the emotional door he assumed would stay open may not stay open forever. That realization creates discomfort, and discomfort creates curiosity. He starts wondering about things he ignored before. Little moments come back to him. Conversations, memories, jokes, plans, promises. Things he once brushed aside suddenly feel more significant. Not because the memories changed, but because his perspective changed. Distance has a way of doing that. When people are available, they often seem ordinary. When they are no longer available, their value becomes easier to see. And that's where another emotion starts entering the picture. Not regret yet, just awareness. Awareness of your absence. Awareness of your growth. Awareness of the space you used to occupy in his life. For a long time, he may have assumed that space would always remain, that somehow you would continue existing emotionally in the same place. But now he sees signs that life is continuing without him, and that realization feels strange, because nobody likes discovering they are becoming part of someone else's past, especially when they assumed they would remain part of that person's future. The truth is, peaceful moving on creates a different kind of impact. It doesn't force attention. It attracts attention. It doesn't demand explanations. It creates questions, and questions are powerful, because unanswered questions tend to stay in the mind, long after conversations end, long after the breakup ends, long after people think they've moved on. That's why he keeps thinking, even when he tries not to, even when he's busy, even when he tells himself everything is fine. Part of him is trying to understand the new reality, the reality where your happiness no longer depends on him, the reality where your peace exists without his presence, the reality where your life continues. And as that reality becomes clearer, the confusion grows stronger, because now he's starting to realize something he wasn't prepared for. You didn't just survive the ending, you adapted to it. And adaptation is much harder to ignore than pain. Pain keeps people attached. Growth sets them free. And when a man starts seeing that freedom, his emotional confusion enters an entirely new stage, because the next thing he faces isn't shock, it isn't curiosity, it's the realization that your silence may be affecting him more than he expected, and that realization changes everything. There is a reason why silence affects people so deeply, and it has nothing to do with playing games. It has nothing to do with manipulation. It has nothing to do with trying to punish someone. The truth is much simpler. Silence removes certainty. And certainty is something most people rely on more than they realize. When a relationship ends, many people expect emotional reactions. They expect phone calls, they expect long messages, they expect explanations, they expect arguments. Even when those reactions are uncomfortable, they still provide information. They tell a person where they stand. They tell a person they still matter emotionally. They tell a person they still have influence. But when someone moves on peacefully and becomes genuinely quiet, that information disappears. And suddenly, there is a gap. A space where certainty used to exist. A space that the mind immediately tries to fill. This is where many men begin experiencing something unexpected. Not heartbreak, not regret, not yet. First comes curiosity mixed with uncertainty. Because the silence forces him to think. When you were constantly expressing emotions, he didn't have to wonder what was happening. Everything was visible. Everything was clear. Everything was available. Now, nothing is obvious anymore. And that's what makes silence so powerful.
It creates room for imagination. And imagination is often stronger than reality. Because when people don't know what's happening, they start creating possibilities. He starts wondering, what is she doing now? Who is she talking to? What is she thinking about? Has she completely moved on? Does she still remember us? Notice something important. These questions are not coming from information. They're coming from a lack of information. The silence creates the questions, and the questions create emotional energy. That's why begging often has less impact than people think. Begging provides answers. Silence creates mysteries. When someone begs, the situation becomes predictable. The other person knows exactly what's happening. They know the emotions. They know the intentions. They know the attachment is still there. But peaceful silence changes the entire dynamic. Suddenly, he cannot predict you. He cannot measure your emotions. He cannot calculate where he stands. And human beings naturally pay attention to things they don't understand. Think about it. Have you ever forgotten something important and spent hours trying to remember it? The harder you try, the more it occupies your mind. Not because the information is there, but because it isn't. The missing piece becomes the focus. The same thing happens here. Your silence becomes the missing piece. And the more he notices its absence, the more attention he gives it. This doesn't mean he immediately wants you back. Real life is more complicated than that, but it does mean something important. His attention starts shifting. Before he was focused on the breakup itself. Now he's focused on your response to the breakup. And what he sees surprises him. Because your response isn't dramatic. It's not emotional chaos. It's not endless messages. It's not public displays of pain. It's peace. And peace carries a message without saying a word. The message is simple. My life continues. That message can be difficult to process. Not because it's cruel, not because it's intended to hurt, but because it forces reality into the open. For the first time, he begins seeing a future that does not automatically include him. And that realization changes something inside him. People often underestimate how much comfort comes from feeling secure in someone's emotional attachment. Even after relationships end, many people assume that attachment remains. They assume they still have access. They assume they still matter in the same way. But your silence challenges that assumption. Every day that passes peacefully sends a signal. Not through words, not through explanations, but through actions. The signal says, I'm moving forward. And eventually he begins noticing it. Maybe through mutual friends, maybe through social media, maybe through changes in your energy, maybe through nothing more than intuition. But he notices. And once he notices, something interesting happens. He starts comparing expectations with reality. Expected reality, you would remain emotionally focused on him. Actual reality, you are focused on yourself. Expected reality, you would struggle to let go. Actual reality, you seem to be rebuilding. Expected reality, you would stay emotionally available. Actual reality, you seem emotionally independent. That gap between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore. And the larger the gap grows, the more he thinks about it. This is where silence becomes louder than words. Because words can be dismissed, words can be debated, words can be argued against. But consistent actions are harder to deny. Day after day, week after week, month after month. Your peace keeps delivering the same message. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer standing still. And that message slowly starts sinking in. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Like water wearing down stone. At first he resists it. Then he questions it. Then he starts accepting it. And acceptance brings a new emotion into the story. An emotion he didn't expect. An emotion that begins quietly. An emotion that hides beneath curiosity. An emotion that often disguises itself as pride. Because before he can face regret, before he can face loss, before he can face what your absence truly means, he must first face his ego. And that stage is coming next. Because when a man realizes your peace is real, his ego often becomes his biggest emotional battle. This is the stage almost nobody talks about, because from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. He seems normal. He seems fine. He seems unaffected. In fact, if you looked at his life during this stage, you might even think he has completely moved on. But appearances can be misleading, because what is happening internally is often very different from what is happening externally. The ego is a powerful thing. It protects people from uncomfortable emotions. It helps them avoid pain. It helps them avoid vulnerability. And most importantly, it helps them avoid admitting they are affected. So when a man first notices that you have moved on peacefully, his ego often steps in immediately. It starts creating explanations, stories, excuses. Anything that helps him maintain emotional control. He tells himself, it's not a big deal. People move on. It's probably temporary. I'm fine. I don't care. And at first he genuinely tries to believe those things, because believing them is easier than facing deeper questions. Questions like, why am I still thinking about her? Why do I keep checking? Why does her silence bother me? Why am I noticing her absence now? Those questions are uncomfortable, and uncomfortable questions threaten the image he has of himself. So the ego does what it always does. It builds walls. The problem is, walls can block emotions for a while, but they cannot erase them, because reality keeps showing up. Your life keeps moving. Time keeps passing. The silence continues, and eventually, reality starts pushing against those walls. He begins noticing things he didn't expect to notice. Certain songs, certain places, certain memories. Little reminders appear when he isn't looking for them. A restaurant you visited together, a joke you used to laugh about, a random photo, a familiar street, a familiar scent. And suddenly, a memory appears, not because he wanted it to, but because memories have a strange way of resurfacing when people least expect them. At first, he brushes them aside. He tells himself they don't mean anything. He keeps moving, keeps distracting himself, keeps staying busy, but the memories keep returning, and every time they return, they bring a question with them. What happened? Not the breakup itself, but the bigger picture. What happened to the connection? What happened to the future he once imagined? What happened to the person who used to occupy so much space in his life? This is where the ego starts losing some of its power, because the mind can ignore facts, but it struggles to ignore emotional patterns, and the pattern is becoming obvious. He keeps thinking about someone he claims not to care about. He keeps wondering about someone he claims not to miss. He keeps noticing someone he claims doesn't matter anymore. Eventually, those contradictions become difficult to ignore. And when contradictions become impossible to ignore, self-awareness begins. Not complete self-awareness, not total honesty, but the beginning of it. He starts recognizing something small at first. Maybe he isn't as unaffected as he thought. Maybe your absence means more than he admitted. Maybe your peace has impacted him more than he expected. This realization doesn't arrive dramatically. There is no movie scene, no dramatic music, no instant breakthrough. It's usually much quieter than that. A moment alone, a random thought, an unexpected memory, a late-night realization, and suddenly for a brief second, the truth slips through. He misses something. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's the connection. Maybe it's the feeling of being understood. Maybe it's the comfort that existed before everything changed. Whatever it is, he feels it, and that feeling creates tension. Because now two forces are competing inside him. The ego says, you're fine. The emotions say, then why are you still thinking about her? The ego says, it doesn't matter. The emotions say, then why do you keep noticing her absence? The ego says, move on. The emotions say, what if she already has? And that last thought is where things begin changing. Because until now, he has been focused on protecting himself emotionally. But now another possibility enters the picture. The possibility that you are genuinely gone. Not physically, emotionally. The possibility that your attention is no longer available. The possibility that your heart is no longer waiting. The possibility that life is carrying you somewhere new. And for the first time, that possibility feels real. That's when the ego becomes nervous, because the ego likes certainty. It likes knowing it still has access. It likes knowing the door remains open. But your peaceful moving on creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is where the ego becomes weakest, because it cannot control what it does not know. That's why many men enter a stage of quiet observation here, not because they are ready to return, not because they suddenly understand everything, but because they are trying to gather information, trying to understand, trying to measure how much has changed, trying to determine whether the emotional connection they once relied on still exists, and what they often discover is surprising. The woman they remember is not exactly the woman they see now. You've grown, you've adapted, you've healed, you've become stronger in ways that aren't always visible. And seeing that growth creates a new emotion, a powerful one, an emotion that often arrives after curiosity and after ego. Because once he realizes you are truly becoming someone who no longer needs him, curiosity begins taking over. Real curiosity, the kind that keeps people awake, the kind that makes them pay attention, the kind that makes them wonder what they may have underestimated. And that is where the next stage begins. Because after the ego weakens, the curiosity becomes impossible to ignore. This is where things start becoming interesting. Because curiosity is different from regret, different from sadness, different from missing someone. Curiosity is a need for answers. And when a man sees that you have moved on peacefully, questions begin piling up in his mind faster than he can answer them. At first, the questions seem harmless, simple, small, almost insignificant. But over time, they become harder to ignore. He starts wondering, what is she doing these days? How is she spending her time? Who does she talk to now? Is she happier? Has she changed? And perhaps most importantly, does she ever think about me anymore? The strange thing about curiosity is that it feeds itself. One question leads to another, then another, then another. Before long, he finds himself thinking about you far more often than he expected. Not because he planned to, not because he wants to, but because unanswered questions naturally attract attention. The human mind dislikes unfinished stories. It wants conclusions. It wants clarity. It wants certainty. But your peaceful moving on provides none of those things. Instead, it leaves him with silence. And silence leaves room for imagination. The less information he has, the more his mind starts filling in the blanks. He wonders whether you're smiling more, whether you're sleeping better, whether you're becoming stronger, whether you're finally finding happiness. And sometimes those thoughts make him uncomfortable, because every positive possibility carries a hidden message. The message is simple. Your life is continuing, and it may be continuing without him. That realization creates a kind of curiosity that feels almost impossible to satisfy. Because he cannot simply ask every question. He cannot demand every answer. He cannot suddenly step back into your life as though nothing happened. So he does what many people do when curiosity takes over. He observes, quietly, carefully, sometimes from a distance. Maybe he notices changes in your photos. Maybe he notices changes in your attitude. Maybe he hears something through mutual friends. Maybe he notices nothing at all. And strangely enough, sometimes seeing nothing creates even more curiosity. Because mystery has a way of growing when answers are unavailable. The less he knows, the more he wants to know. And this is where many men begin experiencing an unexpected emotional shift. For the first time, they stop focusing entirely on themselves. They stop replaying only their own thoughts. They stop assuming they know what you're feeling. Instead, they start trying to understand your reality, your life, your growth, your journey. And that shift matters, because curiosity often becomes the bridge between indifference and emotional awareness. When people truly stop caring, they stop wondering. They stop asking questions. They stop paying attention. But curiosity means attention still exists. Attention means emotional energy still exists. And emotional energy has a way of growing when it remains unresolved. This is why peaceful moving on can be so powerful. Not because it forces someone to miss you. Not because it guarantees they'll come back. But because it creates a reality that demands observation. A reality that cannot be easily explained away. A reality that keeps asking one question. What if she really has changed? That question becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, because change is fascinating, especially when it happens to someone we thought we understood. He remembers the old version of you, the familiar version, the predictable version, the version connected to shared routines and shared memories. But now there is a new version emerging, a version he doesn't fully know, a version he cannot predict, a version that seems comfortable without his involvement. And suddenly he finds himself wanting to understand that version. Not necessarily because he wants a relationship, not necessarily because he wants reconciliation, but because human beings are naturally drawn toward things they can no longer fully access. The more unavailable something becomes, the more noticeable it often feels. That's why he starts paying closer attention. Little details begin standing out. Your confidence, your calmness, your independence, your ability to enjoy life again. Things he may have overlooked before now seem significant, not because they are new, but because he is finally seeing them from a different perspective. Distance often creates that effect. It removes familiarity, and when familiarity disappears, appreciation sometimes grows. Suddenly he notices qualities that once felt ordinary. Your kindness, your loyalty, your patience, your support, your presence. Things he may have taken for granted now appear differently, not because they changed, but because access to them changed. And when access changes, value often becomes clearer. This realization can be surprisingly emotional, because it forces him to confront something he hadn't fully considered. The possibility that losing access to someone isn't the same as losing interest in them. The possibility that your absence is revealing things he failed to appreciate when you were close. And that's where curiosity starts evolving into something deeper. Because curiosity alone asks, what is she doing? But deeper emotions ask, what have I lost? That question carries weight, real weight, because it shifts the focus away from observation and toward reflection, toward self-examination, toward comparison. Comparison between the past and the present. Comparison between what existed and what exists now. Comparison between what he expected and what actually happened. And those comparisons often lead him somewhere he didn't expect to go. Back into the memories, back into the moments, back into the relationship itself. Not through fantasy, not through wishful thinking, but through reflection. And reflection can be powerful. Because once a man begins comparing life before and after your absence, he often starts seeing things differently than he did before. And that is exactly where the next stage begins. Because curiosity eventually pushes him towards something he cannot avoid forever. Looking back, really looking back, at what was, at what happened, and at what may never return. At this stage, something subtle begins to happen. The curiosity is no longer casual. It is no longer a random thought that appears once in a while. It has become personal. Because now, he isn't just wondering about you, he is looking for answers. And whether he admits it or not, that changes everything. The interesting thing about human nature is that people rarely investigate things that have no emotional impact on them. If something truly means nothing, we usually leave it alone. We don't spend time thinking about it. We don't check on it. We don't wonder about it. We simply move on. But when a man starts checking your life, even quietly, it often means that your peaceful absence has created a question he still hasn't answered. That question may sound different for every person. For some, it's, is she happier now? For others, has she replaced me? For others, does she still think about me? And for some, did I make a mistake? Notice something important. At this stage, he may still never say these questions out loud. In fact, many men won't, but silence doesn't mean the questions aren't there. It simply means the questions are happening privately. And private questions are often the most powerful ones. Because there's no audience, no pride, no image to protect, just a person sitting alone with their thoughts, trying to understand what they feel. This is why he begins paying attention in ways he didn't before. A social media update that once seemed unimportant suddenly catches his eye. A new photo gets noticed. A new hobby gets noticed. A new sense of confidence gets noticed. A change in your energy gets noticed. Not because he is obsessed, but because attention naturally follows emotional significance. And the more peaceful you appear, the more significant the change becomes. Because your peace challenges the story he originally told himself. Remember that story? The one where eventually you'd still be emotionally attached? The one where time wouldn't really change anything? The one where your feelings would remain frozen in place? That story becomes harder to believe now. Every sign of growth weakens it. Every sign of healing weakens it. Every sign of happiness weakens it. And every sign that you're thriving without him forces him to reconsider his assumptions. That's where secret observation often begins. Not from confidence, but from uncertainty. People check what they no longer understand. People pay attention to things that challenge their expectations, and you are doing exactly that. The woman he thought he understood is becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone calmer, someone who no longer appears controlled by the past. That transformation becomes difficult to ignore, especially because growth has a unique quality. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply exists. And when growth exists quietly, it often becomes even more powerful, because there is no performance, no desperate attempt to prove anything, no need for validation, just genuine progress. And genuine progress has a way of speaking for itself. The more he notices that progress, the more his attention increases. At first, he tells himself he is simply curious. Then he tells himself it's no big deal. Then he tells himself everyone checks from time to time. But deep down, another realization is beginning to form. Your life is becoming real without him, not as an idea, not as a possibility, as reality. And reality carries weight, because reality means there is no pause button, there is no waiting room, there is no guarantee that things will remain the same. Every day you continue moving forward, the distance between your old life and your new life grows slightly larger, and he begins noticing that, not always consciously, but emotionally. Emotionally, he starts sensing that time is changing things, changing you, changing the situation, changing the future. And for the first time, that future begins feeling uncertain. That uncertainty creates a powerful emotional reaction, because uncertainty forces reflection. Reflection forces comparison, and comparison forces honesty. He starts comparing who you were then to who you are now. He starts comparing life with your presence to life without it. He starts comparing what he expected to happen with what actually happened. And those comparisons often produce surprising conclusions. Conclusions he didn't expect. Conclusions he may not even like. Because the more he reflects, the more he begins realizing something important. You were a larger part of his life than he admitted. Your presence mattered more than he acknowledged. Your absence affects him more than he predicted. That realization doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives through a simple moment, a quiet evening, a familiar memory, a sudden realization, a glimpse of your growth. And suddenly he feels something. Not curiosity, not confusion, something heavier, something deeper, something more emotional. Because curiosity asks questions, but now another emotion is starting to appear. An emotion that quietly changes how he sees everything. Comparison. And comparison can be dangerous. Because when people start comparing what they have now with what they had before, they often begin seeing value they overlooked. They begin recognizing qualities they underestimated. They begin understanding losses they didn't fully appreciate at the time. And that is exactly where the next chapter begins. Because once he starts comparing the present to the past, the emotional impact becomes much harder to ignore.